We gonna do maximum warfare against Republicans. Florida Republicans, you F around, you gonna find out all this stuff. And you know what I said was, listen, and he's like, oh, if you do the redistricting, we're gonna take out all your members, we're gonna do all this stuff. And what I said was, go ahead, make my day. You don't think we're gonna... You want to come down here and spend money in Florida? Roll the dice and take your chances, but don't think that you can come down here, issue threats to us, and somehow you're going to make us flinch. That is not happening, and in fact, it did not happen, because as soon as he came out and started doing that last week, Florida legislature turned around and they passed a new map.
Now, Republicans are trying to claim that black majority districts across the country are racially discriminatory. Yet Florida's governor this week has been out mocking House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries using an offensive accent. What do you make of the GOP's racist rhetoric right now, at the same time they're dismantling civil rights protections that have been an important part of our democracy for decades now?
But remember that this has been DeSantis's MO. You know, just a couple of years ago, he got rid of Black history in our school system. Back in 2022, he actually vetoed the maps from the legislature during the actual redistricting period of time so that he can draw his own maps to dismantle one of our Black electeds' congressional seats in the Panhandle. So this is what Ron DeSantis has consistently been doing. You know, the Stop Woke Act, the DEI attack. And so I'm not surprised that DeSantis continues to stoop lower and lower and lower.
So let me get this straight. Democrats spent years defending congressional maps that were drawn specifically to benefit them politically. But now that Republicans are starting to redraw maps in red states, suddenly it's an attack on democracy, civil rights, and the Constitution. Yeah, okay. So we got to talk about this because this debate right here perfectly exposes how modern politics actually works. And honestly, this whole situation is one of the clearest examples of selective outrage you are ever going to see in American politics. Now, and if you've been hearing about the Supreme Court redistricting ruling and you're confused about what the heck everybody is screaming about, let me break this down in plain English because the media intentionally makes this stuff sound more complicated than it actually is. Congressional districts are basically the lines on a map that determine who represents you in Congress. Every state gets divided up into districts. The problem is, whichever party controls the state legislature usually gets a lot of influence over how these lines are drawn. And both parties have been playing this game forever. Democrats do it, Republicans do it. That part is not new. But here's where this gets interesting. Democrats for years have supported drawing districts based on heavily around race in certain states. I'll give an example just to make it so simple. Let's say, for example, you have a district, right? And it's made of counties. And in one of those counties within that district, let's say District 1, there's a lot of black voters, 40%, 30% black voters, right? And then on the county next door to that county that is 30 or 40% of black voters may have 20% white individuals. And I hate to use race, but this is the whole premise of why I am trying to basically explain to you guys what is this about and what the redistricting situation is, based on what the Supreme Court has deemed it as and shot down what the Democrats don't like in regards of that verdict. So let's say one county within that district has 30% of voters that will keep Democrats in power. The other county next to that other county, the other county next to the 30% of black voters, that is a 20% white. Let's say they meshed them together, the two counties in one district, and they say, okay, well, we don't really care about the white individuals or actually representing them and actually hearing their needs and going to campaign there and actually letting their voice be heard and fighting to earn their vote equally or evenly, because we have just basically meshed two counties together for one district where the majority of the vote is black. So we already know that's Democratic leaning based on this type of race. So we just mushed them together, and then that race that primarily votes Democrat will just win us the whole district, and we don't have to do that much work. Basically, that's what it is. You mush voters together. So they call it splitting or cracking. Well, packing or cracking. Packing is just okay. I'm a pack, like I just used for example, the 30% of black voters with the 20% of white voters. Oh, I know that the Democrat voters, I mean the voters happen to be Democrat leaning, so I'm gonna win District 1 with no problem because all my votes are going to be from the black individuals that are going to make us stay in power. Now, when it comes to cracking, you're basically spreading out those black voters who may be Democrat leaning that you know that guarantees your vote based on the census, because the census determines these maps, right? Based on who are alive. And the census take reports of bodies. And this is an important fact for you guys to know. The census doesn't account if you're legal or illegal. It just accounts that you're here in the United States. And then it basically determines the amount of seats that district is deemed to have based on how many people is in that district. Now, and if you sit there and change the maps, where let's say I'm a pack all of these voters with this certain race because I know these black voters going to vote for me as a Democrat to stay in power. That's all I need is to put all of these voters and pack them in with the other percentage of the voters that don't vote for Democrats. But however, I have all the voters I need to win that district, so I don't really care. And then those black voters that are more Democrat leaning to keep the Democrat in power. They will spread those black voters throughout districts to the simple fact is where there's not enough voters to basically change or overturn those who are in power. So if you're packing all of the black voters in, that's the 30% with the 20% white voters to win you a district, you don't have that many black voters left to keep you in power in other districts. But you spread out the black voters, so there won't be no way to overturn powers in the other district because you don't have enough juice, as in enough voters, black voters, to continue to pack through all these other districts. So eventually those other districts will never change, and those Democrats that happen to be already in those positions in those other districts will just stay there as well, and there won't be no possibility of things being changed based on the actual voters verdict and based on the voters and who they want to represent them, because the maps are basically geared to keeping a certain party in power by packing in one area to overturn things and stay in control for the majority of a district that holds all of those voters. And a lot of people are already in that district. And then the smaller districts, they would just basically not even change or be overturned because they're thin. They're thin margins. There's not a lot of people in those districts. And that's basically the whole summary of that. So their argument, though, with Democrats is basically is this: if you group enough black voters together in one district, you increase the chances of electing black Democrat candidates. That's the simplified version. Republicans have increasingly started arguing that this is literally racial sorting by the government and that districts should not primarily be drawn based on race. That's what this Supreme Court fight was about. The Supreme Court basically said, with all that being said, now that Democrats are panicking because Republican states like Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, and others could potentially redraw maps in ways that give Republicans more seats in Congress. Meanwhile, Republicans are sitting there saying, hold on, you guys already maxed out blue states years ago, meaning y'all stayed in control years ago and y'all packed districts to stay in power. So it's not our fault that you ran out of juice and you don't have enough voters to spread out to other districts that we can take over. And honestly, that's what hypocrisy conversation starts, right? Because the Supreme Court basically said, if you can prove that these maps are not racially driven, then you can redraw them, even though that we know that the Supreme Court doesn't really like to get into the political side of things, but it can based on the premise of race. Does that make sense, family? You follow where I'm going? So now I want to get to this interesting conversation that took place with what's his name? His name is I forgot his name. California Governor Gavin Newsom.
So look, going forward, this is going to have profound and consequential impact on the map in this country. And obviously the impact to the black community is off the charts.
Yeah.
The reality is we don't know yet how consequential it will be for the 2026 election. But we do know with some certainty that there's upwards of 19 or so seats conceivably that they can take back by 2028. But what Landry did, to your point, is jaw-dropping. Talk about not normal. The guy suspended the election. He declared a state of emergency to suspend an election where they had already sent the ballot. I mean, this is literally 2 districts conceivably to eliminate black representation, suspends the election on May 16th. After literally ballots were sent overseas into the military, people were starting to vote. They're starting this weekend, more formally, in early voting. And we're going on with the rest of our lives. None of this is normal. And again, it's a preview, we keep saying it, of everything to come.
Family, what Gavin Newsom is not speaking about is basically this, right? If you really look at it, basically what the Supreme Court was saying when it came to the whole Louisiana case, and basically saying, look, you can't redistrict these maps. They're basically based on race, and the only way you'll be able to change these maps is if they're not based on race. And I gave you guys the premise, the whole overall synopsis and summary of what happened with the Supreme Court of Louisiana, which is why the Democrats are panicking and tripping out and, upset and oppose, and they disagree with the whole verdict. But basically what happened is the Supreme Court, and from my understanding of it, is that they use black voters to automatically stay in power in certain districts, with combining counties in the district wanting to stay in power. One for the whole, in the name of just staying in power. Okay. So when you look at it from who benefits and who suffers, and you look at everything straightforward in simple words, that is basically the concern. Politicians can use black voters as political building blocks to design districts that help certain candidates or parties win. In this case, the Democrat Party. But say it this way, so it don't seem as though it is not really harmful, but just make it as though it's race. That's basically what he's doing. He's saying it a certain way, like, oh, let me say it this way, so it's not a big deal. But when you really look at it, from the whole Louisiana fight, the state has 6 congressional districts. Black voters are about 30% of the state's population, and the NORA map created 2 majority black districts. The Supreme Court said Louisiana used race too heavily to create the second majority black district, and ruled the map unconstitutional. Now, when you look at it, right, if you draw the district right, you can make one party likely to win. The benefit is power. All right. And Louisiana's current setup in Axios, you guys can look up the source, reported that 4 majority white districts are represented by white Republicans, while 2 majority black districts are represented by black Democrats. That shows why maps matter so much, because changing lines can change who wins seats before votes even show up. Now, who suffers? Regular voters suffer first. Black voters can suffer if they are packed into one district, so their voting power is trapped there instead of influencing multiple districts. And then they also can suffer if they're cracked apart, spread thin, so they cannot elect anyone anywhere else. Non-black voters suffer because if they're moved around mainly because of race instead of community, everybody suffers when politicians pick their voters instead of voters picking their politicians, because now the politicians feel like they don't have to actually represent you and actually go based on policy to hear your concerns to actually do anything important in your community, because they already have mapped it out where it automatically keeps them to win. So this whole thing about doom and gloom, what Gavin Newsom saying, what he just said now, I basically discredited that and told you why. The simple fact that he's sitting here basically not saying the truth, but making it though is racially outrageous when it has nothing to do with that. If anything, it's for all race, black, white, whatever, because then it actually makes the politician be for the people, like I just told you, which then uplift their communities, and the politician can actually care because they actually have to show and improve their worth, improve their salt, improve how valuable they are, and actually do something, actually uplift these communities and not let them fall into shambles because you feel like, okay, well, I'm black. This whole thing with the controversy, and this is what some black individuals are saying, just me looking across the internet and just getting overall sentiment to what people feel about this, right? I like to speak about to the majority, not the minority, but a lot of black individuals are saying, look, that is why our neighborhoods is always jacked up and crime is running rampant and things don't get fixed, because a lot of the majority black districts was just voted based on because I'm black, vote for me, and let alone you packed all of us into one district. We all don't think the same. We're not a monolith. So now you just got in based on you mapping things out and packing us as a certain voter pool to automatically keeping you winning, and it doesn't matter because it already benefits you before we even show up to stay in power. And growing up, you know, I had a couple of family members. Some family members believe, you know, growing up in a black family, look, my vote don't matter, and they're gonna do what they're gonna do anyway. What should I vote for? It ain't gonna change nothing. Well, then this actually justifies that and actually shows what Gavin Newsom is trying to deflect about, but really, this is what it has became for years. So if you want to talk about black people, some black people feel like my vote don't even matter because all this time the gerrymandering has been going on, right? From one side of the perspective. And then another side is basically saying, look, some black people are saying, look, we are basically segregation is coming back and basically they're trying to separate us. But if you really look at it, it's for all races, my point in my perspective, because then it actually makes the politician keep it in the hands of the voter. The power stays in the hand of the voters, and actually things could be done because they'll have to show and show their salt and show that they're worth it because they'll actually be doing things and won't be comfortable where they just automatically be voted in and doesn't do nothing in the first place and your community stay in shambles. All right. Now, with the hypocrisy that I feel as though was being explained there with the doom and gloom and racist divisive rhetoric that I strongly dislike was being talked about there that I disagree with. But I told you my perspective and I told you from two sides of the black community from what I've seen on the internet. That's just my take and what I've been seeing a lot of black individuals or individuals of melanin are saying and just individuals in general, right? Because you have non-black individuals, white, whatever, you know, white, Asian, whatever. It doesn't matter the skin color, but you have all individuals saying, hey, this hurts all of our communities because now we're just having a politician racially group certain groups and prioritizing certain groups over other, and that's not right. And that's my perspective on it. So I gave you like three perspectives from how the black community look at it, how white, Asian, whatever race you want to look at it, all races are looking at it. And then I gave it to you from both sides of the coin from the black community. Hopefully that makes things, I'm just giving you guys perspectives. I'm not telling you what to think. We're just having a conversation and I'm just showing you based on the rhetoric. And, you know, hopefully I add value. Give this video a big thumbs up. So now this is where the hypocrisy come in because we have Katie Pavlage, right? We have Kate here, who is basically having a conversation on NewsNation. She's a reporter. Brought something up that Democrats never want to talk about. New England basically has zero GOP representation. If you guys don't believe me, look at the map here. In Congress, despite of millions of Republicans living there in New England, they have zero Republican representation. Think about that for a second. Millions of Republican voters and basically no representation. So you see, Illinois is heavily tilted towards Democrats. Maryland, Massachusetts, California, New York, Democrats have been aggressively drawing favorable maps for years. So now Democrats see it as a problem. If you really look at the results by county, which is the voters in power, you can see the redness to the right. And then in 2024 congressional seats is all Democrats. They don't even give Republicans a chance or voters to really give a chance to vote who they feel should represent them. But when you look at the 2024 presidential results, Democrats disagree with that map. But when it comes to the congressional seats, they agree with that one. Hypocrisy, because they just keeps them in power. Forget giving the Republicans any seats. I'll give you another example. Virginia. If you look at the original map, you see how, you know, Republicans have some seats, Democrats have some seats. But then now it's being redrawn. Democrats, they basically, through cracked up. If you look at number 5 on the original and you look at number 5 over there on the redrawn map, on the Virginia redistricting plan map that we're looking at right now, they split up the districts in small little cracks, basically to, like I told you with the whole example with the black voters, Instead of packing this time, they are cracking. So they're spreading them out and splitting up the districts in small little districts, so then they can just stay in power and nobody gets to overturn anything, because the voter pool is so flat and stretched out that it's not enough votes to overturn anything, and it just keep whoever's in power in power. All right. So now we see that. Now let's look at the Republican. Now you see the 2024 congressional map, and then you see there's still Democrat seats, and then you see the plausible redistricting scenario. You still got a little bit of Democrat seats in there, like North Carolina. You still see a little bit of blue, even though it says 13 plus Republican seats. But they still left some Republican seats. If you look at that, if you look at what the Democrats doing with New England, they got all the seats in the 2024 congressional seats. They see that as fair. But when the Republicans got 13 plus Republican seats, even though they still got some Democrats areas, you can still see couple little blue seats. They don't see that as fair. All right. You see Virginia, they see the original as unfair, and they see the redrawn, the Democrats see it as fair. So I wanted you guys to see that, because that was the hypocrisy in itself. And it's just shocking, right? Republicans are responding politically in states that they control, because when you really look at it, Democrats have been aggressively drawing favorable maps for years, but now they're acting shocked that Republicans are responding, right, in states they control. And the reason this matters is because these congressional maps affect literally everything: taxes, immigration, gun rights, border policy, spending, energy policy. Your representation in Washington depend on these maps. That's why both parties fight over this aggressively, so aggressively. This is about political power, period. But what made this debate, which you're about to see, so wild, with Brian Tyler Cohen tried to basically defend race-based maps while simultaneously pretending Democrats are morally opposed to gerrymandering. And Katie Pavlage, who you see the woman in the red here, the reporter on NewsNation, basically hit him with the reverse card and said, okay, if this is unfair, then why are Democrat states doing the exact same thing in the maps that I showed you? And honestly, once you simplify this issue, the average person can immediately see why people are calling out the double standard. Hit the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and I want you guys to check this out.
And the president is making jokes about it. All right, well, the left is still having a meltdown over a Supreme Court ruling that limits states from using race to draw their congressional maps. That gives Republican-led states the chance to add more seats ahead of 2028. The New York Times laid out a scenario like this, where red states could redraw maps to add up to 13 seats. While Democrats might be upset that Republicans may have more representation down south, they've been quiet about maps like this in New England, where Republicans have literally zero representation. And let's not forget to mention the selective outrage from the very same Democrats who were just campaigning to flip Virginia to a 10-1 Democratic advantage, like former Vice President Kamala Harris.
This agenda has been decades in the making of building up these states around gerrymandering. This is how they play. They are strategic, they think long-term, and they are ruthless.
But Republicans like Wesley Hunt say that race isn't relevant in elections.
There's been a lot of talk how there won't be any black Republican members in the new term. Yeah. What do you make of that?
Nothing. I don't understand how that's relevant.
Is it a problem like recruitment? Or
I don't think it's a problem with anything. I'm not here because I'm black. I am here because I'm qualified representative for Congressional District 38, and the American people choose who they want to choose.
Joining us now is Brian Tyler Cohen, progressive YouTuber. Brian, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. So can you just explain to me how Democrats who are just calling to change Virginia's map are selectively being outraged about the Supreme Court ruling?
This Supreme Court ruling is basically rolling back the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think the fact that you can see Democrats applaud what happened in Virginia does not negate the outrage, the virtuous outrage over what happened at the Supreme Court. When Democrats are applauding what happened in Virginia, it is in response to a cycle that was started off, that was sparked off by Donald Trump deciding that he was owed 5 seats, entitled to 5 seats in Texas, and yet no Republicans had any issue with that. They seem to just decide that if Donald Trump calls for 5 seats in Texas, that there should be no response from Democrats. In fact, I don't remember you saying anything about there being anything wrong with what was happening in Texas. So when Democrats are applauding action, a response in California, in Virginia, that is because Republicans decided to engage in this mid-cycle redistricting and push back against this entitlement that Trump felt in the aftermath of Texas.
Well, first of all, in Texas, the redistricting was legal under their system, and it's still proportional. Let me finish, Brian. It was still legal, and it's still proportional to the presidential election results far more than what we've seen by Democrats way before Texas ever decided to do something. The Voting Rights Act.
That's irrelevant.
That's irrelevant.
You don't get to say this is a better.
Brian, there's nothing in the Voting Rights Act that says you can draw districts based on race, which is exactly what Democrats have been doing in order to maintain political power in Washington. I want to go back to these maps because you say Texas started it. Well, New England, there are 0 seats for Republican representation on Capitol Hill, despite 40% of voters in New England voting for President Trump in the last presidential election. If you look at Virginia and the way that it was, 6-4, now it's going to be 10-1. They had to draw this weird lobster in the middle where you have all of Northern Virginia, which is very heavily white, by the way, disenfranchising voters down in Southern Virginia. There are districts now that voted 75% for Donald Trump. They're now going to be represented by Northern Virginia. They didn't vote for that. You also have Illinois, with 14 Democratic seats, 3 Republicans, when 30+% of Illinois voted for Donald Trump. So you tell me, looking at these maps, how that is a fair representation for Republican voters in states like Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, et cetera.
Right, and we can play the same game in South Carolina, in Alabama, in Louisiana, in Georgia, in Florida, in Texas. You conspicuously left all of those out, but that really raises the question here that because gerrymandering is happening everywhere, shouldn't Republicans support a nationwide ban on gerrymandering? And yet when that was put forward in 2020, yes.
The most gerrymandered seats in America are not from Republicans, as we just showed on the maps. I want to ask you this question.
Wait, hold on. Let me respond to what you just said. First of all, take a look at Dan Crenshaw's previous district and then tell me that gerrymandering doesn't exist in these Republican states. But second of all, every single Republican voted against the 2021 Freedom to Vote Act. Every single Democrat voted in favor of it. That would have banned partisan gerrymandering nationwide. Republicans right now have full control of government.
We all
House,
know
Senate,
that the language
White House.
of that benefited
There are no Republicans putting forward legislation.
Excuse
me. Let me just finish what I'm just saying. There's no legislation being put forward to ban gerrymandering nationwide. So you can, if you think it's such a scourge that you can point to New England and say that there are no Republican representatives, Republicans have the power right now to fix it, but they don't because they know that they benefit from it.
And Democrats are the ones who've been doing this.
Democrats don't have control of government right now. Republicans do.
I want to ask you this.
Do you support it nationwide?
I support the Supreme Court ruling because I don't believe in drawing congressional districts based on race because that's racist. Can Democrats win? I have a question.
Wait.
Brian, do you believe that Democrats can win?
You think it's racist to have representation?
The Supreme Court just desegregated the South.
Having one
Democrats
district
in the South were
in South
segregating the South by having race-based congressional districts, which the Supreme Court just ruled against. That's what just happened. Democrats apparently can't win elections unless they draw districts based on race. Whether they can't win elections because people are fleeing blue states for red states, and they can't win elections because in the census, they are counting illegal aliens as part of congressional districts, which Democrats are opposed to taking out of that because they need them for congressional representation, even though they're not allowed to vote.
So when they crack these districts and black voters in South Carolina,
they can still vote wherever they want. You just don't draw the lines based on race, which is racist. They're desegregating the South.
You're being purposefully obtuse, and your viewers can see that because they know exactly what it means when you crack a district from a jurisdiction where there are overwhelmingly black or brown voters, and now all of a sudden those districts are cracked into 3 other districts so that their voting power is diluted. This is exactly the impetus.
I know that George Wallace and Joe Biden were against desegregation and integration,
for the Voting Rights Act of
Republicans are not for that, and neither is the
This
Supreme
was
Court.
exactly the impetus for the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Brian Tyler Cohen, thank you. Talk to you soon.
Well, the diluting of the voting, like I told you guys an example earlier, is which is the reason why the votes, or let's say the district, wouldn't change, because if the votes are diluted, then that means whoever's in power at that time it goes in favor instead of packing, because then there will not be enough votes for no change in no other districts, because the important district that actually got the power to be upheld was the ones that were packed full of the voters, the black voters that the Democrats wanted to pack all in one district. So when you look at that, right, with the Democrats talking about going to maximum warfare with Hakeem Jeffries against Republicans over redistricting, and right away you could tell how serious this issue is politically, because both parties under control of the House. I mean, both parties understand control of the House and can literally come down to how these maps are drawn. Now, Democrats are framing this as Republicans trying to dismantle black representation. That's the phrase that they keep using. They're saying Republican governors like Ron DeSantis are weakening black voting power by changing districts that were heavily based around race. And if you just casually watch the news, that sounds horrible at first, but here's the part that they leave out. The Supreme Court ruling is basically saying race cannot be the main reason you draw districts. That's the simplified version. Republicans are arguing that government should not be sorting people politically by race in the first place. Now, honestly, a lot of normal Americans hear that and say, wait, that actually makes sense, because think about it like this. Imagine if Republicans openly said, we need to draw special districts mainly to maximize white Republican voting power. Democrats will lose their minds. The media will call it racist 24 hours a day, but somehow when Democrats support districts heavily designed over racial voting blocks, we're supposed to pretend that's completely different. And that's why this argument is blowing up politically. And then Kate Pavlage, you seen the reporter here in this clip, in this video, completely shifts the conversation by pointing out the obvious hypocrisy. She brings up New England, where Republicans have virtually no representation despite large Republican voter populations. And she brings up Virginia maps that heavily favor Democrats, Illinois, other blue states, and Brian Taylor Cohen's response basically boils down to, well, Republicans do it too. Okay, but that's literally the point Republicans are making. Democrats act morally outraged when Republicans redraw maps while ignoring what's happening in Democrat-controlled states. And that's why people get frustrated to listen to this stuff. And honestly, the easiest way to understand gerrymandering is this. Imagine two football teams got to draw the boundaries of the field before the game starts. Of course, they're going to try to create advantages for themselves. That's politics. Both parties do it whenever they can. The real issue is whether either side is willing to admit it, honestly, because Democrats always try to frame themselves as uniquely protecting democracy while pretending their maps are somehow neutral and fair. But when you actually look at the maps, especially in places like Illinois or parts of New England, like I showed you guys right here on the screen, it's obvious both parties are trying to maximize power. Now, to be fair and objective here, Republicans absolutely gerrymander too. Texas get accused of it constantly. Florida gets accused of it. North Carolina, South Carolina. This is not a pure one side evil conversation. The problem is Democrats keep pretending this is only a Republican problem while benefit massively from their own engineered maps. And then Brian Taylor Cohen, he pulls up here and then pulls out the standard Democrat talking point. Well, Democrats support legislation to ban gerrymandering nationwide. Sounds great on paper until you actually think about how that will work in real life, because here's what conservatives don't trust. Here's what conservatives don't trust. Democrats constantly create these so-called independent commissions in blue states that somehow magically still produce maps favorable to Democrats. That's the part average voters notice. The commission is supposedly neutral, but somehow Democrats still benefit almost every time. And conservatives look at that and say, okay, so your solution is basically creating institutions that are called independent, but still lean left politically. And whether people agree with that criticism or not, you can understand why the trust issue exists. Now, if you go deeper, because this issue is actually bigger than maps, this is really about how America sees citizenship and representation moving forward, because the founders understood something very important. Once politics become entirely about different groups fighting for power against each other, eventually the country starts dividing into tribes. And that's why a constitution was built around individual rights and equal citizenship, not permanent political categories based on race. And this is where the modern debate gets uncomfortable, because Democrats argue these race-cautious districts are necessary to protect minority representation, and Republicans argue that constantly dividing people politically by race keeps America stuck in identity politics forever. And honestly, regular people can see both sides. And if you look at it, regular people are like, look, my neighborhood is diverse. I got black, white, Asian. It doesn't matter. Why do we keep reliving this racist, divisive rhetoric? Why do we keep doing that? So America obviously has a complicated racial history. No country is perfect. Nobody serious denies that. The Voting Rights Act originally existed to stop actual discrimination and suppression. That history matters. But the question now is different. The question now is whether the solution to past racial discrimination is permanent race-focused political systems moving forward? Is it permanent race-focused political systems? Because here's the danger. Once government starts organizing representation heavily around race, where does it stop? Seriously. If every group starts demanding special race-based political protections, eventually politics stop being about ideas and becomes entirely about demographic power struggles. And history shows that gets ugly fast. One of the smartest things the founders ever understood is that power naturally expands unless somebody checks it. That applies to both parties. Democrats want more power, Republicans want more power. That's human nature. That's politics, which is exactly why people get so annoyed when politicians suddenly discover principles only when they start losing political advantage. That's why Kate Pavlage was exposing, and that's what she was exposing in this debate. Democrats are furious now because Republicans are finally pushing back aggressively in red states after Democrats spent years maximizing blue state maps. And here's another part people need to understand. Population shifts are changing politics dramatically. Millions of Americans left states like California and New York to move to places like Texas and Florida. That changes representation. It changes districting. It changes congressional power. And Republicans are arguing that the current maps in some states are no longer reflect where people actually live now. Then you add another controversial layer, the census. The conservatives argue that the blue states benefit politically because non-citizens are included in census counts for congressional representation. Democrats argue the census counts total population historically. But again, this becomes a representation fight. Every extra congressional seat means more political power in Washington. And this is why both parties are obsessed with this issue. It's not just about maps, it's about who controls Congress for the next decade. Now, let me give you a realistic thing that applies beyond politics, right? Systems collapse when people believe the rules are different depending on who has power. Trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. And once voters believe institutions are being manipulated selectively, they stop trusting the system entirely. And honestly, that's the part of what's happening across the country right now. People are tired of hearing one standard applied to Republicans and another standard applied to Democrats. They're tired of politicians pretending something is immoral and only when the other side benefits from it. And this is also why federalism matters here. Democrats want federal rules against gerrymandering now because Republicans are gaining ground in red states. But these are the same people who scream about states' rights and protected democracy whenever Republicans want stronger election integrity laws nationally. So people look at that and say, okay, which is it? Should states control elections or should the federal government control elections? Again, the frustration is the inconsistency. So at the end of the day, when you look at this whole thing, in my perspective, I think the common sense solution is this: draw congressional districts based primarily on geography, right? Geography, existing towns and counties and actual local communities, not race and not extreme partisan advantage. Keep the maps compact, simple, and easy for normal people to understand. If people live in the same general area, deal with the same local economy, use the same infrastructure, and face the same regional issues, they should generally be represented together. The goal should be making politicians compete for voters, not designing voters around politicians. And most Americans can tell when a map has crossed a line from normal representation into an obvious political manipulation. If a district has to zigzag across multiple cities, carve up neighborhoods, or stretch halfway across the state just to create a certain racial or political outcome, then it's probably not representing the people anymore. It's about gaming the system. Now, realistically, both parties are always going to fight for political advantage because that's politics. But the healthier long-term approach is keeping districts as neutral, geographically logical, and race neutral as possible. So people feel their communities are actually being represented fairly instead of being used as pawns in a political strategy game. And I think the map should just be represented. People should be represented, and the map should be represented by the people as the citizens living in those communities. Now, at the end of the day, this whole debate comes down to one simple question. Should political representation in America primarily revolve around race, or should it revolve around equal citizenship regardless of race? That's the real argument underneath all the screaming. Democrats believe certain race-cautious districts are necessary to protect minority political influence. Republicans increasingly believe race-based districting itself violates the principle of equal treatment under the law. And that's the actual constitutional fight. But politically, what's driving so much backlash is the obvious selective outrage. Democrats spend years aggressively drawing favorable maps in blue states while acting morally superior about it. Now, Republicans are responding in red states, and suddenly the media acts like democracy is ending. Again, let's be objective. Neither party is innocent when it comes to political map games. Both sides pursue power aggressively. That's reality. But Americans can tolerate hardball politics a lot more than they can tolerate obvious hypocrisy, because the average voter is sitting there watching this whole thing like, wait, so it's only dangerous when the other side does it, and that's why this issue resonates beyond politics. It taps into something bigger people feel across the country right now, and the belief that institutions and political standards are being applied unevenly depending on who benefits. And long term, that's dangerous for trust in the system, because once everything becomes radicalized, tribalized and treated like a zero-sum war for power, compromise becomes impossible. Destruction. Every election becomes apocalyptic, right? And every district becomes a racial battle. Every political disagreement becomes existential, and that is not healthy for a constitutional republic. The country works best when people see themselves first as Americans with equal rights, unity, love, not just members of competing political tribes fighting endlessly for democratic power. So let me know what you guys think. Should race play any role at all in congressional districts? Do you think both parties are guilty of hypocrisy on the issue? And do you trust so-called independent commissions to actually be neutral? Comment below, hit the like button. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on your post notifications so you don't miss the next video. Share it with somebody who needs to hear the issue and, looking at it from both sides, right? With that being said, yeah, family, I just think they need to have maps based on people who actually live there with their communities, and let those communities vote, and stop trying to group them together by packing or cracking or trying to drag them out. Let the communities be existing for what the community is, and you'll get the real sentiment of the community. But I'll see you the next one, guys. On that note, family, peace.